In the world of true crime, some of the darkest horrors don't come from strangers in the night. They come from the house right next door. We think we know our neighbors, we wave at them, share fences, borrow sugar. But behind closed doors, some are hiding obsessions, grudges, and violent intentions. And sometimes the warning signs are so clear, it's almost as if the crime announces itself in advance. These are 3 chilling stories of people who didn't realize the greatest danger was living just a few feet away. Matthew Borman lived a peaceful life with his wife Sarah and their 3 young children in the quiet village of Walton Cardiff, Gloucestershire. He was a devoted father, a kind man, and someone who got along with just about everyone, except one person. Their next-door neighbor, Arslan, had spent 12 years terrorizing the community. What began as petty disputes over parking quickly spiraled into a campaign of harassment and intimidation so extreme that neighbors lived in daily fear. Arslan filmed children's bedroom windows. He made graphic threats of sexual violence and death. He pretended to call hitmen, and the entire street reported him again and again. But despite police involvement, court orders, and even a recent harassment charge, no one stopped him. On October 5th, 2021, just one day after speaking to police and openly stating that he would kill Matthew Borman, Arslan did exactly that. He waited. He planned. And when Matthew returned home from work, Arslan ambushed him on the front lawn and stabbed him 27 times, in broad daylight. As Matthew lay on the ground, Arslan did something truly chilling. He sat on top of his victim's body and lit a cigarette. Matthew's wife, Sarah, rushed to help, but Arslan turned on her too, injuring her in the struggle. Peter Marsden, a retired civil servant who had also spoken out against Arslan's threats. Peter had warned authorities. He'd filed complaints, just like the others. But that didn't stop Arslan. The CCTV shows it clearly. As the camera rolls, we see Arslan, still holding the weapon, calmly crossing the street. There's no rush in his step, no panic, just cold, calculated intent. He walks directly toward the home of his next target, Peter Marsden, another neighbor who had dared to speak out. In an instant, Arslan charges. He forces his way through the doorway and begins his second attack. Peter is knocked back, caught completely off guard. What follows is a desperate struggle. Peter, despite being in his 60s and completely unarmed, fights back with everything he has. He was stabbed 8 times. In the chest, in the arm, but refuses to go down. And then, somehow, through sheer survival instinct, he breaks free. He escapes through a side door and runs. Meanwhile, Arslan steps back outside, as if nothing happened, calm, composed, completely disconnected from the horror he'd just unleashed. Almost immediately, an off-duty police officer, hearing the screams and chaos, runs toward the scene. Without hesitation, the officer confronts Arslan, who remains calm despite the blood on his clothes and hands. The officer lunges, tackling Arslan to the ground in a desperate attempt to stop him. A fierce struggle follows, but the officer manages to restrain Arslan and handcuff him, finally ending the terrifying spree of violence. Neighbors watch in shock, some still trembling from what they had just witnessed. It was clear this was no random attack, but the tragic conclusion to years of escalating fear and intimidation. In the aftermath, the community demanded answers. How had this been allowed to happen? Despite numerous complaints and legal actions spanning over a decade, nothing had stopped Arslan's campaign of harassment. At Bristol Crown Court, Arslan faced justice. The judge described him as highly dangerous, pointing out how Arslan's anger, resentment, and rage exploded into a spree of planned violence. He was sentenced to at least 37 years in prison for the murder of Matthew Borman and the brutal attacks on Sarah Borman and Peter Marsden. Throughout the trial, Sarah Borman's victim impact statement echoed the pain of a family shattered. She described how their lives had been torn apart by years of psychological torment, the constant fear, the sleepless nights, and the horror of witnessing her husband's murder. Arslan was also diagnosed with a paranoid, unstable, and antisocial personality disorder, yet refused treatment or therapy. the case sparked calls for serious investigations into how the police and other authorities had handled repeated warnings about Arslan's dangerous behavior. An independent inquiry was launched to examine the failures that allowed this tragedy to unfold. Shane Gilmer and his pregnant partner, Laura Sugden, lived in Southburn, East Yorkshire, next to their neighbor Anthony Lawrence, 55. Their relationship was tense, marked by ongoing disputes and resentment. Shane Gilmer and Laura Sugden's neighbor, Anthony Lawrence, had long been a source of tension. Their disputes ranged from arguments over noise to personal threats. At one point, Lawrence had threatened Shane with an axe after Shane complained about loud music. Despite attempts to keep peace, the hostility grew. Shane and Laura became increasingly concerned about Lawrence's behavior. When they reported his cannabis use to their letting agency, citing the fumes were harming Laura's and her daughter's asthma, the situation deteriorated further. Shortly after this complaint, Lawrence was served with an eviction notice. Although there was no direct proof linking Shane and Laura to the eviction, Lawrence believed they were responsible and sought revenge. He escalated the feud by dumping horse manure on their lawn, a deliberate act meant to intimidate and insult. The neighbors' relationship became bitter and hostile. In January 2018, Lawrence planned a violent attack. He broke into Shane and Laura's home by removing bricks from the shared attic wall between the two properties. Quietly entering their loft, he hid there, waiting for his victims to return. After a night out, Shane and Laura came home, unaware of the deadly trap. Suddenly, Lawrence emerged and attacked with a crossbow, firing multiple bolts. Shane was struck repeatedly and died at the scene. Laura, who was 5 months pregnant, was seriously injured but managed to survive. The police investigation revealed that Lawrence had premeditated the attack, hiding in their loft with the weapon ready. His previous threats and violent tendencies were well documented. At trial, the evidence showed a clear pattern of harassment and escalating violence. Lawrence admitted the attack, but showed no genuine remorse. He was convicted of murder and attempted murder, receiving a life sentence. Michael Wickham and Edgar Campos were neighbors in a Sydney suburb with a tense and troubled history. Over time, their relationship deteriorated, marked by frequent arguments and occasional threats. On May 6, 2020, the situation came to a head. CCTV footage captured Wickham approaching Campos's property in a visibly angry state. He confronted Campos aggressively and threw the first punch, sparking a violent altercation. Campos reacted by grabbing Wickham in a chokehold, attempting to restrain him. The hold lasted for over 2 minutes. During that time, Wickham initially struggled, fighting to break free. Eventually, he became unresponsive. Neighbors who witnessed the scene shouted for Campos to release Wickham, fearing for his life, but Campos maintained the hold until emergency services arrived. Sadly, Wickham was declared dead at the scene. Edgar Campos was arrested and charged with manslaughter. His defense argued he acted in self-defense, stating that Wickham had initiated the attack. However, the court noted that the chokehold was a deadly use of force and lasted too long. In 2021, Campos pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a prison sentence of 5 years.